Well, I feel a real debt of gratitude to the Savages for the work they do, and to all of you. And I just would echo that point. This is a team effort. We need you. People over the years have helped make the school what it is, and so I hope you will chip in. And I hope you've had a great day today. I was in my office earlier in the week, and I had a funny conversation. Someone came in, and I was working on my remarks, and this girl said, "Mr. Mack, do you have a speech writer?" And I thought, no, I don't have a speech writer. We actually do our own work here. But I feel privileged to be able to speak to you. I love this opportunity. I think you being here, it means much to me, and I always want to explore an idea or give you a little bit of my thinking. And so today, I'm actually going to talk about a faculty member, and I want to talk about what great teaching looks like at Taft. And the speech might be called "On Dick Cobb and the Solid Satisfaction of Teaching." And if you don't know who Dick Cobb is, you're about to learn. I want to back up and say that in September of 1912, and I know this from reading his letters, after a summer of travel and vacation, Horace Taft wrote a letter to his best friend and college roommate Sherman Thatcher, who was the head of the Thatcher School in Ojai, California. And he closed the letter with this line. He said, "I've seen a good many men this summer, and I've talked about different modes of life, and have concluded that there is a solid satisfaction about the work we folks are doing in schools that simply does not come to most." I love that last sentence. I think it's so fitting for teachers here. There's a nice understatement in the phrase, solid satisfaction. Teaching is a good life, he's saying. And I found myself reading the letter not long after I received a phone call from the local police 3 weeks ago, saying that longtime and beloved Latin teacher Dick Cobb had died in his sleep in his 4th year of retirement from Taft. And here's a picture of Dick. Now, Cobb began, some of you may know of him or have heard of him. Cobb began teaching at Taft in 1969. He was one of the great coaches in our history, with girls basketball winning almost 300 games from 1973 to 2001. But maybe more importantly, for 44 years, he taught Latin and advised and challenged and cared for students in a way that we will never see again. I think we should always be careful of the word legend, but it's right here. We lost a giant. And I'll confess that I grieved when he died, but I like to think that he knew that kind of solid satisfaction that Taft spoke of. So I want to talk about him today as a celebration, but also for you to be able to understand what those Taft teachers you saw today strive to be. I want you to know Cobb. He was one of us, and he was the best of us. And when I think of Cobb, and by the way, that's how many of us just referred to him, by that name. When I think of what made him special, I think of 5 principles that marked his teaching, and I think they formed the legacy of what teaching at Taft is. And here's the first. The first principle was assess often. In his classes, Cobb assessed a lot, maybe more than anyone else. Now, the last decade or so has seen a considerable cognitive work done around educational assessment. Basically, the question of how do we understand what students are learning. And the literature is really interesting. It's profound. I don't think Dick Cobb ever read deeply into it because he didn't have to. He had, over his years of teaching, already discovered what we now know to be true, that durable learning comes from repeated low-stakes assessment. It turns out that Dick Cobb's old-fashioned teaching was pretty forward-thinking. Now, the best book on assessment is a book called Make It Stick, and I highly recommend it. It's a book about how we learn and how we retain information. And the authors argue this. They say, if we stop thinking of testing as a dipstick to measure learning, if we think of it as practicing retrieval of learning from memory rather than simply testing, we open ourselves to another possibility, the use of testing as a tool for learning. It's actually a profound claim, and it's a book that I shared with the faculty. There's a lot going on in that claim because it actually asks teachers to think about testing in a different way than we often do. You know that the end of semester, we're going to have a big exam. The exam is given, students cram, they learn, and then they promptly forget. Make It Stick argues for something totally different. They write, practice that is spaced out, that is interleaved, that is interwoven with learning, and is varied, produces better mastery, longer retention, and more versatility. In other words, carefully sequenced and carefully designed quizzing leads to greater learning. And that was Cobb. I think more than any teacher on campus, he was making it stick. Now, this is a technique he began in his early 1970s, and over the years he developed it and perfected it. When John Wilson took a sabbatical and interviewed great retired teachers all over New England, he met with Cobb, and Cobb said, quote, Unannounced quizzing became part and parcel of my approach. You have to keep them a little nervous. 10-minute quizzes could come at any time, and repetition moved the learning into the deeper parts of the brain. The Make It Stick authors could not have said it better than that. It moved the learning into the deeper parts of the brain. His pedagogy rested on repeated, difficult practices in retrieval of old and new materials. His students often complained in a good-natured way, but they were learning. The number of times a student would say, Mr. Mack, I had another quiz and I bombed it with Cobb, and I said, don't worry, you're going to get another one, right? Here's what one alumnus wrote. He never announced his tests, knowing that we'd all cram and promptly forget. It was maddening at the time, but it was really the best way to learn a language. Another shared, he had this no-test policy, just a series of impromptu quizzes, which meant you had to always be on your game. I wasn't, but I learned that I had to if I was going to play at that level. And a third simply said, every quiz made me think. Cobb was onto something long before Make It Stick was published. Second principle that he left all of us, I think, and behind his teaching was his understanding that in the classroom, you must engage your students. Now, we hear a lot about the challenge of engaging distracted adolescents, insufficient sleep, short attention spans, the tug of the screen time, temptation of social media, and so on. I am sure this is true. I suspect teenagers have always been distracted. I say that even knowing some are in the audience here. Great teachers, I think, in all spaces and all times have had an ability to engage, right? They've had an ability to have students walk in the class and immediately engage, almost like gears in a transmission. Now, Taft students are pretty remarkable, but if you can believe this, they actually can sometimes be tired or bored or distracted. And to engage students in Latin is no small task. After all, it is called a dead language. But Cobb did so, and because of this, alumni are still telling stories about his teaching at reunions. Now, how do we engage students in class? We engage in two ways, by personality and by pedagogy. Personality, of course, is that collection of qualities, energy and authority and intelligence and empathy and so on, all of those things which bring students to the task of learning. Pedagogy is the approach of learning, right? It's the design, the architecture, the phasing, the pacing, the structure of teaching. Now, Cobb brought unique personal qualities, If you surveyed students for adjectives, you would have heard a lot of words like tough, scary, funny, caring. That's a really rare list, and not everyone can pull them off. To be clear, he could be a little terrifying, and that's not a bad thing. You knew that if you came into class unprepared, you were going to be exposed. He had a keen sense of humor, and it edged between irony and sarcasm, but it was absolutely clear that he loved working with teenagers. He had great fun. Classes were lively, humorous, and rapid. When you walked into class, you strapped in. One graduate wrote me, when I heard the sad news, instantly an image of Cobb standing outside of his classroom as we came in, white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, greeting us by our last names as we entered. Crossing that threshold meant something. It was a different zip code than anywhere else on campus. And his pedagogy was tried and true. I love this picture of him. He never sat in class. Never sat. He wandered around making eye contact, calling students unpredictably by name, continually demanding engagement, snapping jokes. To John Wilson in this interview, he said, I started walking around that horseshoe of desks, right? Not a circle, but a horseshoe. I started walking around that horseshoe of desks early in my career, and it worked better than any alternative I ever tried, including sitting down. Now, it was a teacher-centered class to be sure, but it was very interactive. The phrase I heard most often from graduates was rapid fire. You knew he was aiming questions precisely, that there was no hiding, and they were coming fast. With Cobb, play and rigor could live side by side. Cobb's kinetic presence, the way he moved in and out of student airspace, the rapid shifts in eye contact, the hand gestures and pointing, the modulation of voice, the staccato questioning, the balance of solemnity and humor, all of that contribute to a learning environment that was at once safe and supportive, but also challenging and discomforting. And you better be on task. There was student myth, and I think they really believed this, that Cobb had eyes in the back of his head. Because even when he was writing on the board, he seemed to know who was staring out the window or goofing with a peer. Even before he turned around, he might say, Charlie, can you give us the ablative declension? And Charlie would be leveled a stare and catch a hint of a smile, and a wink busted. One alum wrote me, said, "Mr. Mack, I remember my dad sitting in class on Parents' Day with Cobb. He told me after that his palms were sweating because he was afraid he was going to be called on." Another, you can imagine the students feeling every day. Another alum wrote, "The master Socratic teacher. He was my favorite teacher in all my years, and he taught, frankly, a class that candidly I detested, and that's not an easy thing to do." Cobb was doing what research tells us is critical in classroom. You create a web of supported and challenging relationships, and everyone was connected and engaged. And I like to think that every Taft teacher, in diverse ways, right, diverse ways depending on their personality and pedagogy, is aspiring to that same kind of engagement. Here was his third principle. Cobb thought the teaching was supposed to be fun. He thought it should be fun. Now, teaching is exhausting work. It's really serious work, and I think sometimes we as teachers think that the future of humanity depends on whether our students can distinguish a Petrarchan from a Shakespearean sonnet or determine the area of a parallelogram. We run the risk of taking ourselves too seriously. Cobb never did. I can't remember the theme of this annual, but he's being fed grapes by Moni Hardwick, a colleague of his. Cobb thought that being around teenagers was fun work, in part because they continually surprise us, and he knew humor helped student learning. In that interview with Wilson, he said, "Humor was always central to my teaching." And I think the observation is true, but it doesn't go far enough. For Cobb, it's not that humor was part of his teaching. Humor was part of who he was. He was really serious about the things we should be serious about, but he also joked and needled and laughed and pranked. There are scores of funny Cobb stories. A graduate wrote me that when Cobb retired, he came back to lunch to congratulate him and to pay homage. They talked for an hour. At the end of the meal, the graduate asked, "Mr. Cobb, what was the hardest thing you ever did at Taft?" Without missing a beat, Cobb replied, "Making a Latin 3 exam easy enough for you to pass." Here's the story of a graduate from the early 1970s. I've changed the name to protect the guilty. I know this grad well. He wrote, The only exam I had to take my spring semester senior year was Latin. I was I was the worst Latin student ever to attend Taft. Cobb helped me study for the final, making several cryptic remarks about which passages I might consider memorizing for future reference. I think he was doing this, you might want to look at this one here. So I went into my exam, nervous, but having memorized the suggested passages. A day or two later, I see Cobb in the hall. He gives me a thumbs up and says, "Smith, only just barely, but you are all set to graduate." So we are here, no, it's not over. So we are here at graduation, ready to parade out to the expecting parents. Cobb comes down the line, congratulating everyone. He stops and looks at me and says, "Smith, I took another look at your exam. I'm sorry to say there are several points I had to take away." And I'm crestfallen, panicked. What will my family say? I'm supposed to graduate in an hour. In a nanosecond, I see his wry smile, the wrinkle of his lips, and realize that he's playing me. So I haul off and hit him in the arm, a reflexive response. He never forgot, and for the next 40 years, we always had a good chuckle about that interaction and how I was the worst Latin student ever. To the last day, I greeted him with a punch on the shoulder. I got this letter from a man who would, believe it or not, become the head monitor. "Dear Mr. Mack, Cobb was special. I remember tossing a water balloon out of the 4th floor window, only to realize upon leaning out to watch the glorious splatter on the sidewalk that it actually landed on or near his head. He looked up at me in the window with a very gratified look and in the most jovial way informed me what I would be doing for penalty crew the following Saturday." And then one graduate wrote, "He just had a wicked sense of humor. We spent hours laughing, no question. Sharpest wit and sense of humor I've ever known. In class, he had this sharp, alert sense of humor that let his students know, make sure they were dialed in." I don't know how many letters I received like that. He reminded us, when we do this really serious work with teenagers, that we've got to find humor. He did it every day. It was as if teaching had preserved in him the innocence that all great teachers have, that capacity for joy that leads us into a job and then it just won't let us go for the next 40 years. Cobb ended that interview with Wilson and he said, "You know what? I had a lot of fun." And that's not a bad lesson, a bad legacy to leave your colleagues. Cobb's fourth principle was this. His fourth principle was we should demand a lot out of our students. We should have really high standards, and we shouldn't lower them. Now, the single best book on teaching that I know is a book called What the Best College Teachers Do. And I highly recommend this, by the way, What the Best College Teachers Do by Ken Bain. Bain went around various college campuses, asked people who are the best teachers on your campus, and then he interviewed them and others. And one of his discoveries was this: what do the best teachers do? They expect more. Right? As simple as that. They expect more. He heard this over and over again, that the great professors had high standards and they asked a lot of their students. Now, that sounds obvious, but it doesn't mean that it's easy. You can have high standards that are meaningless and utterly unable to inspire, or perhaps even worse, dispirit students. But the best teachers, he found, have a knack not only for asking a lot of their students, but also communicating the faith that they can reach those expectations. And nobody did this better than Cobb. Bain wrote, "The best teachers we encountered in our surveys and research expect more from their students. Yet the nature of the more must be distinguished from expectations that may be high but meaningless. We found that the best teachers usually have strong faith in the power of a healthy challenge, but they also have an appreciation that excessive anxiety can actually hinder thinking. Thus, while they help students to feel relaxed and to believe in their capacity to learn, they also foster a kind of healthy disquietude. Right? There's a balance that the great teachers have, unsettling students to some extent, but also letting them know that they're going to be supported." And he's described Cobb's class perfectly. It was a disquieting class. That is, this was not a safe space, if safe meant easy or soft or uncritical. When students walked by Cobb at the door, they knew that they were going to be unsettled and challenged and pushed, but they also knew there was so much love and faith for those students and for their capacity. And out of that kind of mysterious alchemy came magic. One graduate wrote me, "He was going to make me earn it on effort, if nothing else. I used to always complain to my friends, but I really enjoyed learning from him." Another, "If you weren't prepared, Lord help you when he looked at your classmate and smiled and then called your name." Here's one, "I never worked harder for another teacher, and my fondest memories of class with him." By the way, it reminds us that nobody remembers their easiest teacher they ever had, right? They remembered he was the hardest I ever had, and he was my fondest memories. "The fact that I have 3 degrees in classical studies," one woman wrote me, "is because of Cobb. His class was a place of challenge, and you had to be on your toes. His standards were the highest on campus, but everything he did, every word he spoke said, you can reach them." And that's why a lot of teachers, when they came to Taft, came new. They heard, if you want to see how a teacher with really high expectations get kids to meet them, you got to go sit in on a Cobb class. Final Cobb principle maybe is most important. It was this: be there when they need you. Cobb was really good with lots of students, but he was at best with those who were struggling, those who made mistakes, maybe were mad at grown-ups, maybe in pain. Actually, that sounds like adolescence, doesn't it? He was blunt and honest, and he could give a serious scolding, and he never let students make excuses. But he was there for you, hell or high water, and it's why so many loved him and so many were heartbroken when he died. "You have to care," he told John Wilson. "It's about kids. It's about their progress. And that's why I never considered teaching at the college level." And you saw this care in Latin class. Cobb lived in the gray house near the baseball field. It's this one right over here. In the old days, it was our jig. For most of his years, he lived there. And if you were struggling, he was there to help. He shared with John Wilson, "It was clear to me early that students learn differently. So I thought it was important that I saw my students individually for help. They never needed an appointment, any night except Saturday." Now, given the number of letters I received, you would think that there would be a path trod in the grass from the feet of hundreds of students who trekked to his house for help in Latin. I used to make that walk across the fields at night because I was such a terrible student. He went above and beyond. I have memories of walking across the baseball field for Latin tutorials every Tuesday and Thursday night. I have so many memories, sitting in his house at night, reviewing Latin declensions and playing with his aptly named dog, Octavia. He never let me miss my weekly Latin study sessions at his house. I confess, I found great solace in reading those letters. They told me that this bachelor probably never had an evening alone. I like to think of a dark sky, the lights of the main building, the quiet of campus, and a student walking back to the dorm after an hour of Latin with Cobb. And he was most present, I think, for the student who was struggling personally. He could show the most exquisite empathy one minute, and then he could have a blunt honesty the next. And he knew exactly which was needed and in what proportions. A past mother wrote me, "My son would not have made it through Taft or be who he is today without Mr. Cobb, especially after his stupid shenanigans of his lower mid-year." Another woman emailed, "He believed in me even when I didn't believe in me." There are hundreds of Taft graduates and faculty who carry Cobb with them. One experienced teacher here shared that when she was faced with a tough decision, her own children would ask her, "Mom, what would Mr. Cobb do?" Here's part of a letter I received from a woman who recalled how he had helped her when the family issues were too much. "I was flailing, but then Cobb and I got to work. Every night after dinner, we met by the pond and we walked around several times. Sometimes we spoke, other times we walked in comfortable silence. I would go see him for extra help in Latin, and after we would talk about the trials and tribulations of my day. My entire life, I have sought him for guidance, advice, and comfort." Cobb believed in every student, and he never left them. And to the day he died, he was receiving birth announcements and wedding invites and golf outings from alumni. When I met with the faculty on the day after he died, I offered remarks about one of the finest educators I've ever known to a faculty that shared many of those same qualities. It was hard to think that we were never again to see him in that room again. And when I was done, we all lingered. I remember sharing that Cobb would have told us to stop talking about him and get to class. But in a room of tears and hugs, there was a sense that there was a legacy, right? You really felt a presence that made us better. And he left us those 5 principles that I know I probably have thought about a lot, but we'll think about much more, and I think all the faculty will. Those 5 principles: assess often, engage students, have fun, hold them to high standards, and be there when they need you. I would argue that a faculty aligned around those principles will do good work, and I hope you saw some of that today. We should let Horace Taft have the last word because he really would have liked and he would have loved Cobb. In February 1920, Taft was writing Sherman Thatcher again. I come back to this correspondence that he had. Midwinter letters from headmasters tend to be a bit fatigued, and here he was at Taft on a snowy campus in Watertown, and there was Thatcher, in the sunny orange groves at the Ojai Valley. And Taft complained about politics and the, quote, small men in Washington. He added that on campus, measles and mumps are pretty much everywhere. He vented a bit that, quote, the movies and automobile and pleasures of home make the job of teaching seem impossible. But he ended this way. This is his last sentence. He said, "Sherm, yet I do feel that the boys get a pretty good development of character, and they respond pretty well to the influence here. The result is plain and humdrum enough, but not to be despised, and the good of it, in some cases, is far-reaching." It's perhaps my favorite of all of Horace Taft's words. There's a bit of January reflection. There's a bit of a New Year's resolution. It's part midwinter blues. And there's a lot of humility, the kind of humility that I hope still marks the school today. The extraordinary result of the school he describes as just plain and humdrum. He describes the mission in that odd negative, not to be despised. And at best, he says, in some cases, the good is far-reaching. It feels right to think of those words when we look at my single most favorite image ever taken of Taft. It's Cobb in his last year on his way to work. It's all you need to know about what teaching at Taft looks like. He's walked the same path to campus that some student trod the night before. You can see the briefcase stuffed with quizzes. There's something ageless, maybe even iconic in that posture. His pants are rolled up a bit since the grass is wet with dew, and it's morning. The sun red on the buildings, and the 8:15 bell will ring soon. Cobb will stand at the door of his classroom for about the 10,000th time, greeting his students by their last names. He'll shut the door, smile, and start firing questions. I think Dick Cobb would like Taft's rumination about teaching. Cobb was a laconic New Englander, not prone to hyperbole, no interest in accolades, and certainly uncomfortable with the legend tag. He was just a man who taught at Taft for over 4 decades, who no doubt felt the solid satisfaction in the job, and whose good, in that remarkable understatement, was in some cases far-reaching. So I hope you got to see a little bit of Cobb today and a little bit of the great teaching that happens at Taft. And I welcome you to this day, and I hope it was a wonderful day. I look forward to seeing you for the rest of the day. So thank you very much.